Hello and welcome back to the Finding Hope with OMS webinar series for our session with Brett Drummond from MSTranslate. My name's Sian Southwood, I'm the Head of Programmes and I'm joining you from here in London in the UK. In a moment, I shall be welcoming Brett to the stage to talk about the latest research from the ECTRIMS conference, that's the European Committee for Treatment and Research in MS. But before I do that, I just wanted to run through a bit of housekeeping to keep the webinar running as smoothly as possible for you. Just to note that the webinar is being recorded and you'll receive access to a link later on in the week, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint that Brett is going to talk us through. You'll also notice, because it is a Zoom webinar, there isn't an audio or video function for webinar participants. However, you can submit your questions at the bottom of the screen through the Q&A. And Liz, my Community Engagement Programme Manager, will be helping in the background to facilitate some of your questions. If you are experiencing any technical glitches, then we recommend simply logging on and logging off and logging back on again, and also using a Chrome browser seems to work well. We've tried to make the webinar sessions accessible, so there is subtitles at the bottom of your screen. If you click on the three dots, you are able to hide those subtitles for your webinar. As you exit the webinar, there will of course be a pop-up survey. Your feedback is invaluable to us. It helps us to shape future sessions. And I'm really pleased to say that there will be a season next year, so we will be returning. The webinar will run for approximately an hour, but Brett has kindly said that if we do overrun, then he's really happy to stay on and answer any other questions that we want to get through. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Brett onto the virtual stage. Hi, Brett.
Thanks, Sian. Hi, Sian. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're so pleased to have you. We were saying earlier, weren't we? It feels like a long time in the planning to have you as part of one of our webinars. So we're really grateful to have you today. Tell us again what time it is that you're joining and where you're joining us from, if you may.
Yes, I'm joining from Melbourne, Australia. The accent probably gives it away that I'm from down south. And it is 8:30 p.m. in the evening here, though I have just recently come back from having spent a week in the Netherlands for the ECTRIMS conference and then a few weeks in the UK post that for some other work meetings and a little bit of relaxation. So I'm not actually quite sure what time it is in my head, but the clock tells me it's 8:30 p.m. where I am at the moment.
And just checking, yeah, it's 9:30 a.m. where we are in the UK. Yep. So we're all good and we're all here. So I shall pop off the screen now and hand the floor to you, and then I'll be back later with those questions. Thanks so much.
Okay,
Brett.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I will share through my PowerPoint slides and get this going. So welcome to everyone that's watching in. As Sian said, I'm going to be talking about a few different things in the presentation today. I'm going to talk a little bit about MSTranslate because a lot of you may actually not have much of an idea who I am or who MSTranslate is or what MSTranslate is. And then in the second half of the presentation, talk about what's hot in MS research, largely based on things that we heard at the recent ECTRIMS conference. But I really encourage as many questions as possible. The questions are really the important part of what we talk about today. I'm obviously going to talk about things that I think are interesting and are important, but I want to make sure that you're getting information that is also valuable to you. So please do ask as many questions as you want to. I'm happy to hang around as long as possible today to answer as many questions as I can. So as I said, before I get into talking about the research side of things, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about who I am and why I guess I'm qualified to be talking to you today about research into multiple sclerosis. So before I get into talking about what MSTranslate is, just to give you the background on who MSTranslate is. So obviously MSTranslate is myself. You can see there, and it was co-founded 10 years ago. Actually, we just celebrated our 10th birthday in late 2012 with my brother Eric, who is the other half of MSTranslate. So my background is actually in multiple sclerosis research. I did multiple sclerosis research for many years, really looking into what causes the immune system to start attacking self, what causes the breakdown in tolerance that we see in MS. My brother Eric, however, came from a web and social media background, and just so happened in 2012 when I was spending late nights in the lab, he was planning on moving back from the UK where he'd spent the last 4 years living, and we started talking about how we might work together. And I think one of the biggest things that I'd noticed while I was doing research into MS was how big a gap existed between people doing research and the people who were actually directly impacted by that work. As an example of that, in roughly the 10 years that I was involved in MS research, I think I might have had 2 opportunities to talk to people living with MS about my work. And so really we wanted to find a way to help bridge that gap, and that's what MSTranslate does. So just to separate it slightly, MSTranslate as an entity really exists in 2 separate forms. So MSTranslate is a science communication consultancy company, and we work with organizations, medical research groups, biotechnology companies, and not-for-profit organizations to help them communicate about research in multiple sclerosis, but also in some other neurodegenerative disorders as well. But largely what I'm going to be talking to you about today is MSTranslate, the platform, which is the science communication initiative side of it. So MSTranslate, the platform, really exists to bridge that gap between people living with multiple sclerosis and the MS research world. And in a nutshell, how it does this is by providing updates on the latest developments in MS research in a way that's easily accessible, easy to understand, but still accurate. And it's really those last 2 that are critical and sets us apart from a lot of other platforms that are available. I want to stress that we're certainly not the only platform that's doing this and doing this well, but we think that there are some things that make us a little bit unique in the space. The fact that it's accurate and easy to understand comes from the fact that, as I said already, I have an MS research background, so it means that I really understand the research to a high level of detail. But I also have a background in science communication, so it means that I can communicate that research in a way that is easy to understand, but doesn't lose that accuracy. And that's often what we find. Those 2 things don't necessarily go together. When research is communicated in mainstream media, while it may be easy to understand, often it loses the accuracy that's important. And if it's communicated by scientists, while it definitely maintains that accuracy, it isn't always that easy to understand. And so in terms of where we exist, if you do want to find us, and I do encourage you all, if you're not yet following MSTranslate and you do enjoy this presentation, please do follow us online. We have our website, which you can see on the right here. The website is where all of our unique content sits. So that's where all of the videos that we publish, all of the articles that we write are found. Any historical content you'll also be able to find on our website. And then, of course, we're also across all of the social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Really, if I was to suggest a couple of these to follow, Facebook is where a lot of our conversations happen. We have a lot of discussion under our posts on Facebook, and that's where we'll not only post our unique content, but also links to other content online that we think is valuable and accurate and informative, but the place where we can then chat about it. And also YouTube, which has been our largest growing community, and where you'll find a lot of video content that we create, both of me talking about research and doing research summaries, but also video interviews that we do with researchers. And we've done a few of those coming out of the ECTRIMS conference. Twitter is also really useful, especially around conference time, because we do live tweet conferences. So if you go to our Twitter account and go back a few weeks, you will have seen all of the tweets that we put out during the ECTRIMS conference. And as Sean said, these slides will be accessible, so obviously don't need to madly try and copy those down at the moment. You'll be able to find all of those links to do it if you are searching for MSTranslate, just because this is a common problem that people face, and my slides don't really help with it because of the way that they're formatted based on the title of this layout. It is capital MS and then lowercase translate. So that's what you should type in to give you the best chance of finding these platforms. And so just to give you an idea as to how my work is for MSTranslate, every day for me starts by opening 2 emails. I have a PubMed update email. And so a PubMed update, PubMed is a database of journal articles. And so every morning I get an email with any new publications that have come out on multiple sclerosis in the past 24 hours so that I can stay on top of the research that's going on into MS. And then I also get a Google Alerts email that shows me headlines or articles that have come up on the internet that Google has indexed with multiple sclerosis in them. You probably can, it wouldn't shock you to know that one of those emails I open with a lot of interest, and the other one I sort of open slightly hesitantly because I'm never quite sure what I'm going to find in there. Also, importantly, I do open them in that order, and I'm going to explain in a second why I do open them in that order. So this is where we exist, who we are and what we do. But I guess the big question is why? Why is there a need for a platform like MSTranslate? And so I'm just going to share a couple of examples of some things that have come out over the past few years, articles about MS research. So here is one that was published in 2018 with the exciting headline, "Doctors believe they have discovered the cause of multiple sclerosis." Now, this article was shared on many, many news sites across the internet. You don't need to worry about all of the details here, but I'll just read the first paragraph. "A vaccine for avoiding multiple sclerosis has moved a step closer as doctors believe they have discovered the cause of the disease." Now, as someone who's very invested in MS research and the lives of people living with MS, this is obviously a very exciting headline. If you're a person living with MS, then this is obviously an incredibly exciting headline. You're going to read this with a lot of hope because you've probably been told a number of times that the reason why we can't really talk about a cure for multiple sclerosis is that we don't really know what causes it yet. And until we understand the cause of MS, we can't get a cure in the purest sense of the word. So reading a headline where they say, look, we've found the cure of MS is going to be really exciting. However, the problem is this article was a little misleading. And as I said, the important thing is that I open my emails in a couple in the order that I do with the PubMed updates first. And so when I saw these articles coming out, I did know the research that it was referring to because I'd seen the research article beforehand, and it was this one here. So this is a journal article published in a well-respected multiple sclerosis journal, Multiple Sclerosis and Related Disorders. Multiple sclerosis is caused by 3 hits, strictly in order, in genetically susceptible persons. Sounds really good. The important thing to focus on here is the hypothesis part at the start of that title. And so actually what this article was is that was a couple of researchers who had sat down and read a number of different articles that had been published on multiple sclerosis. And they'd started to try and piece together those jigsaw puzzle pieces. They'd said, well, based on the information that we have, maybe, this could all make sense if we put this bit together with this bit and arrange some things like this. And here's a theory. Based on what we've read, here's the theory. The thing is that that's all they had done. They hadn't done any research in animal models. They hadn't done any research in humans. They hadn't done any clinical trials. They hadn't done any cell culture studies. They hadn't done anything other than sit down and put a theory paper together. Now, that is really valuable to do because it gives avenues for people to look at. But I think you would all probably agree with me that there's a big difference between doing that and discovering the cause of multiple sclerosis, like is being published here. And so this is the problem with the way the system exists, is that we see these things happen. And I'd like to say that these are isolated incidents, but the unfortunate reality is that they're not. And as I said, when you are a person living with MS who is hugely invested in this research, it's not just that we look at that and go, oh, you know, that's not great. That's you know, a bit of a stuff up on the way of the media. It's that it creates real problems, because for me, I know what the next 48 hours for me is when I read headlines like this. I know I'm going to get people contacting me who are really excited and really hopeful and want to hear all about this research. And I have to be the one to say, yeah, sorry, it's not as exciting as it sounds. And as I said, these aren't isolated incidents. Here's another example. I could give lots of these, but I'm just going to keep it to two. So again, the headline here, vitamin D could cut multiple sclerosis symptoms. First sentence of the article, taking hefty supplements of vitamin D could help to reverse some of the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, according to a study. Again, this is very exciting for people living with multiple sclerosis. Vitamin D is easily accessible. And here we're not just talking about something that can help a little bit in terms of, you know, stopping to slow the disease or something like this, but this article is claiming that it's actually going to reverse some of the symptoms, something that none of the existing therapies really do. So again, really exciting. But what was the reality around this research? Well, here's the article that we posted on MSTranslate, and I will agree that the feature image that I've used for the article, the chemical structure of vitamin D, probably not quite as interesting as the one that the newspaper articles were using. And you don't need to worry about the outcomes. This was part of a larger article, but I'm just going to summarize quickly what the research that article was referring to actually showed. Firstly, they did actually, in this instance, do some studies in humans, in people living with multiple sclerosis, but all they did was find that using the high dose of vitamin D that they were looking at was safe for people living with multiple sclerosis. That was it. They didn't look at any clinical outcomes. They didn't look at any symptoms in people living with multiple sclerosis. They didn't even look at symptoms in any animal models. What they'd seen is that when they took cells and cultured them in a laboratory, if they gave them or incubated those cells with a high dose of vitamin D, what it did was it changed some of the cells in the immune system from cells that we know are damaging in multiple sclerosis to ones that seem to be more protective. Now, while that's interesting, it's a really large jump to go from that to reversing symptoms of multiple sclerosis. And so MSTranslate exists to try and make sure that we don't get these sensationalist articles, or if we do, we have a location where people can go to ask questions and find out what the reality is, get the details about the research, get some context about what that research is showing, and then get some answers to their questions. So to continue on with that theme of why does MSTranslate exist, or what are the benefits for it, I really break this down into 4 key areas: information, participation, advocacy, and design. And I think it's really important that we focus on some of these things, because these themes are really overarching as people living with multiple sclerosis in terms of how you can impact on the research space. So information, participation, advocacy, and design. Because I'm a scientist by background, I like to try and simplify these things. So I've sort of called this my iPad model. And because we're talking about health and how we can improve health, I've gone with the Apple symbol of an apple a day keeps the doctor away. So the Apple iPad there. For some reason, I don't seem to be able to get that through trademarking yet, but I'll keep working on that. It keeps getting held up for some reason. But I just want to really briefly go through each of these just to talk about, again, why I think it's important and why I'd like you to participate in pages like MSTranslate, but other ones that you also think are valuable in the space. So information, as you've already gathered from things that I've talked about, information is obviously going to be the major pillar of what we do. People with MS have questions and they need answers. Having shifted from looking at multiple sclerosis at the research bench to then working in the field of MSTranslate, it's always really exciting for me, but also really mind-blowing for me to see how informed people living with MS are about the research that's going on. And it makes sense. MS is obviously a chronic illness. You want to stay on top of the research that's going on, but it's often people living with MS that are bringing research to my attention as well. But so there are always going to be these questions. They need answers, but they need those answers to be accurate and easy to understand. And the problem is that a lot of information out there on the internet isn't always following those two things. I also think that there is a need for the general understanding of research to be improved. You're not always going to be able to take every little piece of research that you see to platforms like MSTranslate or other ones, but having an understanding of, what sort of assays are we looking at here? Was this in an animal model? Was this in human studies? What sort of numbers of participants were involved? Did they have controls? Was there placebo? All of these different things are important aspects that we talk about on MSTranslate that I think are really important. And also because there are times when we need to make sure that messages get out quickly but accurately. COVID-19, I think, is a really good example of it. We've obviously lived and continue to live through the global pandemic. And at the start of it, while there obviously was for the general population as well, people living with MS were particularly concerned. How does this affect me as someone who's living with a chronic autoimmune disease? Am I more susceptible if I get it? Am I going to get sicker? Am I more at higher risk of dying from COVID-19? Does it matter what medication I'm on? Do I need to stop my medications? All of these questions. And we needed to make sure that information got out quickly on that, but in a really responsible way as well. And MS organizations and teams around the world did a really good job of this. We did a Facebook Live video with 3 neurologists from one of the hospitals in Melbourne, where we accessed about 20,000 people within the first 12 hours and gave them access to that high quality information. So I think that's one of the big things. Information is always going to be one of the main things that we do. And just jumping ahead or jumping from this to go, before I go on to the other ones, one of the things that I know other people in the field refrain from being involved in these spaces and giving information is that they're worried about interactions that they're going to have online on social media. And I want to highlight an instance because I think that when talking about ways that we are different from other platforms that are out there, is that we really take a responsibility of making sure that we engage in conversations. I personally am of really firm belief that posting information and then not being available to answer questions is probably more irresponsible than not posting the information to begin with. It doesn't matter how well you write an article or how well you explain something in a video, people are going to have questions. They'll either need it to be simplified further, or they'll want to know more, or they just want to ask something completely different. And so we make sure that any comments that come under any of our posts, we do our best to respond as quickly as possible to all of those, regardless of what that comment is. There's always a question. And so while across the 10 years, we haven't had many examples of anything really negative being posted, I just want to give an example of something that was, I guess, a little bit negative and show how we handled it, just because I think it's important to talk about how these conversations can happen and how they can proceed. So this was actually a comment that was after that Facebook Live video that we talked about in terms of the COVID-19. So a comment went up, cannabis is the greatest thing for MS, end of story. These freaks are just money-making big pharma minions. So that included me in there. It's probably a good place to mention that MSTranslate is almost essentially completely unfunded for the work that we do. But I would say, having been in this space for a long time, if a comment went up like that on a lot of other pages, that comment would either just be deleted, hidden, or just not responded to. That's not our style. And so I responded. You don't need to read my response. Clearly, I'm not as concise as the person who posted the initial comment, but I basically made 3 points. In terms of cannabis, you're completely free to believe whatever you want to believe in terms of what's best for your management of multiple sclerosis, but there's no scientific evidence to suggest it is at all effective against COVID-19, which is what the topic of this webinar was. Made the point that MSTranslate was unfunded and none of the people who participated in the video were paid for their time. And thirdly, that while we encourage all sorts of discussion on MSTranslate, it just needs to happen in a respectful way. I got a notification not long after I'd posted that this person had responded again. This is when you start to think, okay, are we about to get into a really long back and forth? But here was their response. Again, you don't need to go through all of this. They apologized, explained why they were just sick of reading things on other pages. Take care, thanks for calling me out in a poor comment. I responded again, and then I think it's this last one that is really important. I'd linked to them to some content that we'd done on cannabis before, so that they could look at that in a different context. They apologized again, pretty embarrassed now that they've had some time to think about it. They'll keep the post up so that people can see the well-measured response. Take care again. So I think it's really important to see that MSTranslate is a place where really respectful discussions can happen on a wide range of topics, and we will always make sure that we respond and engage. And I think that's really important in this space. So I'll go through these next ones quickly because I want to make sure we leave time for plenty of Q&A, and I want to get onto the research side of things. But obviously participation is another reason to follow pages like MSTranslate, so that you can be notified when trials or studies are recruiting that you may be interested in. Obviously, the potential to crowdfund for research that you believe in is something that's going to get bigger in the future, I believe. But also what we think is really important is that the relationship between researchers and people living with MS and the MS community needs to be two-way. We understand, having spoken to our community a lot, that there is often a feeling of we only hear from researchers when they need something from us. And so we're really trying to shift that dynamic so that researchers are participating on our pages just to inform people of the research that they're doing, to have chats, to keep people updated on their science and what they're doing. And then if down the track they want to recruit for a study, at least they've given some time before they're asking for something in return. Similarly, in terms of design, I actually think that research has a lot to learn from people living with multiple sclerosis. I often say that, having been involved in MS research for a really long period of time, I understand MS pretty well in terms of I can tell you what we know about the immune cells that are involved, give you some ideas about things like genetic susceptibility factors and environmental risk factors and how we think they may be involved and things like that. But what I don't understand is the lived experience that only people living with MS can explain. And we have definitely had interactions before when we do these webinars or live Q&As with researchers, where the researcher will walk away from that having heard something from a member of our community and say, I didn't understand that was something that people living with MS experienced, but now that I know that, I have an idea what might be causing it, and I can go away and research it. So I think that this dynamic and this notion of two-way interaction and bringing people living with MS closer to the research community is really important in terms of being able to accelerate research and make sure that the research that's being done is the best research to benefit people living with multiple sclerosis. And lastly, advocacy. I think that we should never underestimate the power of the voice of people living with MS in terms of shaping research direction. And in terms of shaping research direction, it can also result in increased research funding. The more powerfully the community talks about their desire to see research funded, the more likely they are for governments and not-for-profits to get behind that research. And also improvements in care. And one of the ways that we've seen that here in Australia is in terms of pushing for reform in one of the service provisions that helps people living with multiple sclerosis. So that's a bit of a background in terms of what MSTranslate is. Certainly not everything, and I'm more than happy to answer questions about MSTranslate as well. So if you do have any, feel free to share those and ask those. I'm happy to answer them at the end. But now shifting into the second half of the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about what's hot in MS research. And again, this is largely based on what we heard at the ECTRIMS conference. And so I'll talk through, I've sort of got a rating system here almost in terms of what seem to be the biggest topics. But I will talk through them and how they fit into the bigger context as well. So lifestyle modifications was something that was talked about. I've only put it low on this scale at the moment, which is not to mean that it's not important. I'll just talk through what was talked about at the conference and you understand why it's down there, but we'll talk about that in a bigger picture as well. Personalized medicine, remyelination, were also big topics. EBV is probably the biggest topic of 2022, and I'm going to give a big focus on that and explain that research in a moment. And I've just, almost as a little bit of a joke here, put podcast hosting. So it was my sort of pleasure and privilege this year to be the host of the official ECTRIMS conference podcast. So this was the first time that the conference had actually launched a podcast. So we did daily summaries for day 1, day 2, and day 3, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here, with key guests from the conference. So day 1 was with Professor Brenda Banwell, who was the keynote speaker. She gave the ECTRIMS lecture. Day 2, Timothy Curtsey, who's from the National MS Society in the US. And then day 3, Martin Torre, who is the incoming president of ECTRIMS. And they shared their insights with me about highlights from the conference. So I definitely suggest you subscribe to that podcast. Some of the episodes will be slightly more technical than others, but some of them certainly will be aimed at the MS community. So you can find that on Apple and Spotify. And as well as those podcast episodes, I can also reveal that there will be future episodes coming out. Some have already been released. I've already recorded a couple, including one on a topic that I know is of interest that I'm going to be talking about in a second. So subscribe to that podcast. It is just called the ECTRIMS podcast, because we have a lot of interesting extra episodes planned, including ones on diet and lifestyle, which may be particularly interesting. But I'll mention some of those as we go through the rest of the podcast, the rest of the webinar. So as I said, EBV has probably been the big story of 2022 when it comes to multiple sclerosis. So EBV, or Epstein-Barr virus, is the virus that causes glandular fever or infectious mononucleosis, depending on what part of the world you're from. But importantly, just to say from the top, what we need to know about EBV is that while a lot of people are infected with Epstein-Barr virus, very few people will go on to show any symptomatic signs of being infected. So while a lot of us get infected, very few of us will get glandular fever or see that. And so in terms of this, I just want to break this down in terms of where we were, where we are now, and where we're going, just to really explain this story, because you've probably heard a lot about it online this year. But I really want to make sure that there's a good understanding of what this research has shown, because it is potentially really exciting. So just to give you a bit of background on this in terms of where we were, EBV is not something new in terms of multiple sclerosis. I started as an MS researcher in 2005, and EBV was something that we were talking about back then as potentially being involved in multiple sclerosis. But this is what the story really showed. Back then, the studies seemed to indicate that about 95% of people living with multiple sclerosis had been infected with EBV, and about 90% of the general population or healthy controls had been infected with EBV. So while the numbers were slightly higher in people living with MS, it was hard to really believe that there was much of an association, because, you know, we had people living with MS that hadn't been infected with EBV developing MS, and the numbers were high in both groups. So really, it just looked like EBV was a really common infection across the population. But importantly, the reason that we thought that is because the numbers, again, just to reiterate, were about 95% in people with MS and about 90% in healthy controls. Now, this all changed in 2020, when we had this paper published in May from a German group. And this group looked at about 1,000 people living with multiple sclerosis, and using more sensitive techniques that had been developed, they found that 100%, so every person living with multiple sclerosis that was included in this really large cohort, had been infected with Epstein-Barr virus. So this changes things, because 95%, well, we had people living with MS that hadn't been infected. So it was really hard to think about it as potentially being a cause. But now we're seeing 100%, and this changed. This was then backed up in January of this year by a study that came out of Harvard that also looked at a cohort of around 1,000 people and again saw 100% of people had been infected with EBV. 100% of people living with MS had been infected with EBV. What was particularly interesting about this new study was that this was a study done in a cohort of US military veterans. And what is interesting about that cohort is because they were in the military, they had blood samples of them throughout their life. And so what they were able to see is that in a small cohort of those patients, they had blood samples where they hadn't been infected with EBV yet. So they couldn't see any sign that there was an EBV infection. And so they looked at the blood samples in these cohorts and they looked at two things. They looked to see at what time did they get infected with EBV? And also, when was there a presence in the blood of a thing called neurofilament light chain? And neurofilament light chain is something that we're looking at in MS as being a biomarker, essentially a marker of damage to nerves. So neurofilament light chain, or NFL, is something that gets released into the blood when nerves get damaged. So what they could see in this cohort of people is that when they hadn't been infected with EBV, there was no sign of NFL. So there was no indication that there was any nerve damage, no indication that their multiple sclerosis had already started to develop. And it was only after they got blood tests where they tested positive for EBV that then after that, they started to see damage to the nerves. They started to see NFL appearing in these blood samples. So based on that, it looked like the multiple sclerosis couldn't develop until after EBV infection had occurred. And so based on these couple of studies, now our thinking around this is that EBV seems to be necessary, but not sufficient to cause multiple sclerosis. And what does that mean? It seems to mean that if you aren't infected with EBV, you cannot get multiple sclerosis. That's our current thinking. But obviously a large percentage of the general population are infected with EBV, but never go on to develop multiple sclerosis. So it's necessary, but not sufficient. EBV alone is not the cause of multiple sclerosis, and that's something we need to be really clear about. But so then we started to think, well, how could this be the case? And actually slightly later in January of this month, another paper came out that showed that there was essentially cross-reactivity between immune cells in people living with multiple sclerosis with parts of the EBV virus. So parts of EBV were being recognized by those antibodies that could also, those same antibodies that were responding to the virus, were also responding to parts of a protein that makes up nerves. And so what seems to be the thinking around this is possibly it's really a case of mistaken identity. So the immune cells that become activated to respond to the virus in a completely normal way, in a way that we would expect them to do, then start to recognize parts of the nervous system as being the virus that they're meant to be responding to. And it's just that these two parts look very similar that the immune cells get them mistaken. And so this story is starting to come together. We're starting to see evidence as to the fact that EBV seems to be necessary, and we're starting to understand how it may be involved. There are still more pieces to the puzzle that we need, because we need to understand why a lot of people get infected with EBV but never develop multiple sclerosis. And this is probably a lot to do with other genetic and environmental risk factors that we know about, but understanding how that all fits together is still something that we need answered. But so where are we going with this? Why is this important? What does this actually mean? So it means one of two things. Firstly, it means that prevention could be possible. Are we at a stage where we might be able to prevent multiple sclerosis from occurring in the future? Theoretically, if EBV is necessary for MS to develop, then if we could stop infection with EBV, we could stop multiple sclerosis from occurring. And so Moderna, who we know from the COVID vaccines, have developed an mRNA vaccine for EBV. This is still a long way away. earlier this year. They've just tested that on the first healthy individual. It's a long way away from being ready to actually be used as a vaccine for EBV, even if it passes through all of the tests that it needs to go through. And then we still need to see whether or not it will be effective enough to prevent multiple sclerosis. But it's still exciting to think that that may be the case. Obviously, for people who are already living with multiple sclerosis, that's not particularly useful, but it's also, this EBV story also has potential therapeutic benefits. So Atara Biotherapeutics, as well as a group in Australia, are currently looking at clinical trials to see whether or not clearing EBV from the body can have benefits as a treatment for multiple sclerosis. So EBV infections are chronic in people. They never get completely cleared, but these groups have found a way that they can basically take T cells and make them hyperactivated against EBV, inject them into people living with multiple sclerosis, clear that infection, and they have seen in very small early stage trials that this does seem to have clinical benefits. So the interesting and I guess exciting thing about this is it's a targeted therapy. It's not just like our existing therapies where we try and block different parts of the immune system. This is targeted specifically at taking out the EBV and then getting benefits from that. So moving on now to some other things that were discussed at the conference. One of the big things that I just wanted to focus on quickly was that there was quite a large discussion around the role of the MS nurse and how important they are in the care of people living with multiple sclerosis. There seems to be a push in a lot of areas around the world to make access to MS nurses greater, so that more people living with multiple sclerosis can have the benefits that having an MS nurse as part of their management team provides. So it was great to see a session on that. And there is a podcast episode that has come out on that as well that you can listen to. I obviously want to spend some time talking about lifestyle modifications. Now, the reason I put this down at the end of the scale is not because of the importance that lifestyle modifications have. It's mainly around how it was discussed at this year's conference. And I think largely there wasn't any huge updates. Most of the things that were talked about at the conference in terms of exercise, smoking, diet, and sleep were probably things that we'd heard at previous conferences. There didn't seem to be much development in that area. I'm still going to go through them. While I think that that may come across as potentially glass half empty, you know, why are we not finding out new things in this area? I tend to think of it the other way. One, I think it's great to see that even though there weren't huge updates, there is still a dedicated session to it at the largest MS research conference in the world, because I think there's now a commitment that we need to be talking about this and making sure that we're putting a focus on this research. And also, I think it starts to show that we've made a lot of progress. And so, you know, we're talking about things in the same way because we've already made great strides on it. So to go through these, just really quickly, and again, if you have questions on any of these topics, we can obviously discuss them in more detail in the Q&A part. In terms of exercise, there is obviously a big consensus around the benefits that exercise can provide, and then it's really important that we're finding ways that people living with MS can exercise, understanding that the types of exercise that people can be doing is going to differ in every individual, but finding ways that every individual can start to incorporate exercise as part of their MS management plan. But one of the most interesting things that I think I heard in that session was around the notion of prehabilitation versus rehabilitation, and this understanding that we need to be building exercise in from the very beginning so that we can preserve function rather than waiting until function starts to be lost and then trying to restore it. The US MS Society has also published some guidelines based on research that a number of people have done there on the use of exercise in people living with multiple sclerosis that is then helping to guide healthcare professionals around that area. Smoking, again, there was nothing big on this. We know that smoking definitely increases the susceptibility of developing MS, but also that it worsens progression. And we know that there is no point at which quitting smoking stops being beneficial. Stopping smoking at any time during the disease course in multiple sclerosis helps to reduce that risk of accelerated progression. Now, in terms of diet, obviously a particular focus of people in the audience for this presentation. Again, there is a big consensus that dietary modifications are an important part of managing multiple sclerosis. There is a consensus on that, and that it needs to be looked into, not only to help manage multiple sclerosis symptoms and the benefits that it can have for that, but also because we know that people living with multiple sclerosis are at a higher risk of a number of comorbidities, and these comorbidities can definitely be reduced by having a healthy, balanced diet. Though the discussion at the conference is that there isn't evidence yet to suggest that there is one overarching diet that is the best diet for people living with multiple sclerosis. And so I think the takeaway from that at the moment is that yes, diet is important. Yes, diet is something that people should be looking into. But at the moment, we're at a point where people really need to find the diet that works the best for them. And that's going to differ between different people. And really, the best thing is just that this needs to be approached scientifically in individuals to work out what works for them. Sleep is the other thing. This has maybe come around a little bit more over the past 12 months, but there's now an understanding that sleep independently associates with fatigue in multiple sclerosis. So sleep is something that can be targeted. So trying to target sleep quality and improve sleep quality in people living with multiple sclerosis is a way that can be used to help decrease fatigue in people living with MS. Excuse me for a second. So the other big topic that was discussed was remyelination. And so just to give you a little bit of a background on remyelination. So remyelination or myelin repair is something that we know is possible and is a common occurrence, not just in multiple sclerosis, but in lots of conditions. If there's an infection in the brain, if you have a concussion, often myelin can be damaged during this, but that myelin gets repaired. We also know that myelin repair is really common and happens in people living with multiple sclerosis, especially early in the disease. But that ability to repair myelin appears to decrease over time in people living with MS. And there is something that blocks that system, and potentially multiple things that block that system of myelin repair. And so there are currently lots of studies going on and early stage trials going on to explore how to overcome this barrier, and being looked at from a number of different areas and a number of different ways that can be done, targeting different aspects of that process. I'm not going to go through all of them based on time, but I do just want to talk about one, because it's probably the most interesting clinical trial that's going on at the moment. So one of the key things, as I sort of mentioned, that seems to be important in terms of myelin repair is this concept of aging. As we get older and as cells get older, they seem to lose this ability to repair myelin. And so what's been looked at as one of the best ways to reverse or slow the aging process has been intermittent fasting. So I'm going to focus largely on a study that's come out from the University of Cambridge in this area that's now proceeded into a clinical trial. What they showed in an animal model of multiple sclerosis is that if they took mice that underwent a dietary protocol of intermittent fasting and they used an alternate day fasting approach, so the mice only ate every second day, they found that those mice had a better ability to repair the myelin that was damaged in this animal model of MS compared to mice that just had a normal diet. Because they wanted to see whether or not they could look at this in another way, they also looked at using metformin. So metformin mimics the process of fasting. And similarly, they also found that metformin was able to lead to improved myelin repair in these mice. In a separate study, just to follow on sort of the thread, calorie restriction, so not fasting here, but just calorie restriction, has also been shown to lead to improved myelin repair. But this intermittent fasting metformin study from Cambridge has now progressed into a clinical trial. We've got a podcast episode on the ECTRIMS podcast coming out with two of the key members of that trial that I suggest you listen to. It should be out early next year. But this trial is purely looking at the metformin part, and it's going to be metformin combined with clemastine, which is another compound that's been shown to promote myelin repair. They will be doing a follow-up trial looking at the intermittent fasting aspect. However, based on feedback with people living with MS that they interviewed in the lead up to doing the clinical trial, those people indicated that they thought the fasting protocol would be difficult to adhere to. So they've started by looking at metformin. So I'm going to really quickly go through these because I want to get to the question and answer part of things. But just to talk about a couple of other topics that were talked about, personalized and precision medicine were topics that were looked at, extended dosing and individual monitoring. So this was one of the talks given at ECTRIMS. You can see all of the abstracts from the conference on the ECTRIMS website. But basically what's being looked at here is now with some of the treatments where they've got standard dosing protocols in, so timeframes to give different doses. They're looking at, can we extend out the period of time that we give this treatment and still maintain the clinical benefits while reducing some of the risks? And they have found that that's possible. So they're looking at some stuff here where they can extend out, keep the dose of the drug high enough that it maintains the beneficial aspect of controlling the disease, but really significantly reducing the risk of PML, which is something that, especially with Tysabri, is a concern. Similarly, there were talks looking at how AHSCT fits in. If you want to talk about stem cell therapies, ask a question. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. But this was particularly interesting because they looked at how it compared, outcomes of it compared with some of the higher efficacy therapies. And they found that in terms of reducing relapse rate, AHSCT was significantly better than fingolimod or Gilenya, slightly better than natalizumab or Tysabri, but there was no difference between AHSCT and ocrelizumab or Ocrevus. Other topics that we can talk about if you want to ask questions, progressive MS was a topic that was discussed at length at the conference. New biomarkers that might both help monitor whether we're talking about relapsing remitting or secondary progressive or primary progressive MS, as well as predicting future disease course, and pediatric MS were also discussed as part of that meeting. So I'm going to bring that to an end. Sorry for rushing through the last part, but I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for questions. Happy to answer any questions that you have. In summary, there is a lot happening in the world of MS research to be excited about, but make sure you're finding a great place to access that information. That's meaning you're getting it in an accurate way. And we're always open to conversations. So as well as following us on all of our platforms, where you can contact us through those as well. My email address is there, and feel free to contact me directly if you have any thoughts or things that you want to share. So with that, I will stop my screen sharing and take any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks so much. There's a lot of information there, and yeah, definitely take a breath. Just to reiterate, actually, while you're doing that, obviously we've said that the PowerPoint will be made available on our website. So all of those links and information, people can access it in their own time, and obviously they can equally watch the webinar back and listen again to some of the questions and answers. So thank you very much for that. You started to touch on it towards the end, actually. You said some of the highlights, I guess, from the conference. So one of the questions that we've had, which was submitted prior to the webinar, is around treatments for secondary progressive MS. And somebody's asking, are there anything out there, because they're not currently on any medication? So was there any learnings from the conference that you took away?
So there is now currently a treatment that's specifically available, or has been made available, certainly in parts of the world. And obviously I'm going to talk a little bit, sorry, with the Australian lens on, and not 100% understanding whether or not it's available in different parts of the world at the moment. But siponimod is one that's become available. It's specifically for people living with secondary progressive MS, that's shown in clinical trials in this area that it can have benefits. I think beyond that, one of the biggest learnings that we've had in the secondary progressive space, that again was mentioned at the conference, is that we can't just talk about secondary progressive MS as a one-size-fits-all thing. So there was for a really long time thought that we have drugs that benefit people with relapsing remitting MS, And then once a person goes to secondary progressive MS, these drugs don't work anymore. And this was even the case in terms of how regulatory bodies would think about this around the world. And once a person transitioned to SPMS, access to drugs stopped. But what we've found over recent years is that this isn't necessarily the case. And we have people living with secondary progressive MS that could still have quite active inflammation. And so that's really what these drugs target. It's not the fact that they target relapsing remitting, it's just that the predominant feature of the disease in relapsing remitting is this inflammation. And so what's been shown is that in people living with secondary progressive MS, if they still have inflammation going on, what we would call active secondary progressive MS, these drugs can actually still be really effective. And so I think that's probably, in terms of answering the question, the biggest thing is understanding that the drugs that we've got that can be really effective against relapsing remitting can actually be really effective in secondary progressive MS if there is still that inflammatory target to go for. But as well as that, siponimod is another one that's come out, and looking at the use of stem cells, but in particular, not the AHSCT that I talked about in that, but a different type of stem cells called mesenchymal stem cells. They're stem cells that are more involved in the neurological side of things. They will develop into cells that form part of the nervous system. There have been some early stage trials that have shown promise in people living with secondary progressive MS around that as well. That's still a little while off. They were sort of phase 2 trials that have been looked at. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to hear some phase 3 trials of that going on at next year's conference.
Lovely, thank you. Somebody's asked, they'd like to know what is necessary for the remyelination of our nerves. I hope I've said that okay.
Yeah, it's a great question, one that we probably don't have a great answer to at the moment. We know that, the cells that people are really targeting at the moment, which you saw on the slides, are called oligodendrocyte precursor cells, or OPCs, and these cells are the ones that develop into the cells that create the myelin. And so what seems to be part of the problem is that those cells lose their ability to do that. They lose the ability to mature into the cells that create the myelin. So we know we need those cells maturing. Beyond that, we don't know a lot more in terms of what are the problems. We know the pathways. I won't go into all of the different molecules that are involved in the pathways. We know that, but what causes the problem or where exactly the block is, we don't have a great idea of that. But that's what all of these different trials are looking at. People are looking at all of these different areas of those pathways to see, if we jump in here and interfere with this, is that something that will help? But yeah, we don't have a great answer to that. It's a really important question. We just don't have the answer to that yet.
Okay. Somebody's asking, how is MSTranslate funded? So you said that it's not from, didn't you say it wasn't from pharmaceutical or?
It's basically not at all, is the short answer to that question. So MSTranslate in terms of, pardon me for a second. MSTranslate in terms of those platforms that I talked about, everything that you see on our website, everything that you see across our social media platforms, our ECTRIMS coverage, that's all almost completely unfunded. In terms of how we manage to pay rent and pay our bills, that comes from doing work for other organizations. So at the very start, I mentioned that MSTranslate exists as both a company and an initiative. So while we would love to get paid to do all of our MSTranslate activities, so we could focus all of our attention on that, we do other work with other clients that brings in some money. But yeah, largely, other than little bits and pieces that come in, for a few little things. MSTranslate is just completely unfunded, and we do it because we believe really strongly, passionately about how important it is.
And on the subject of paying bills, obviously cost of living crisis is becoming, obviously it is a reality, and we're coming out of, COVID hopefully, and lockdowns and things. Have you seen, and was this discussed at ECTRIMS, have you seen a sort of a drop in the appetite for research, and certainly the funding that sits behind that into MS?
I think I would answer that by saying that research funding has always been terrible. It's to put it bluntly, in terms of Australia with research funding, I think the last round of research grants from our National Health and Medical Research Council, the main research funding body here, the success rate was about 16%. So, 84% of grants that are being put in for research projects aren't getting funded. And that's continued to decrease across the years. It can only be harmed from COVID-19. Just that there is a lot of financial problems that have come out of that. It seems to have stabilized. I don't think we've seen huge effects of it yet. In terms of the appetite for the research, I don't think that's necessarily disappeared at all. I think what we said, and I mentioned this before, is that what we did see, the silver lining through the COVID-19 pandemic, was we got a really clear indication of how quickly progress can be made when science is given the appropriate funding and resources. And we saw that with how quickly we were able to progress COVID-19 vaccines. So it's always a difficult space, but researchers are very used to living in that space of having to try and continue to fight for money so that they can do work that they believe in. I think we'll continue to see the effects of COVID-19 over the next couple of years, and it'll be interesting to see how those pots of funding change, if at all. But it hasn't been too noticeable at this point. It's just always been a struggle.
I'm just going to do a time check with you because we are running. As long as you're happy to.
I'm happy.
On. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Because we've still got questions coming in.
Keep asking them.
Okay. So sometimes I was thinking about diet. Should you avoid alcohol if you have MS, if you're living with MS?
It's a good question. It's not something where I've seen any definitive research suggesting that. I think in terms of diet modifications and really specific things on an individual level, it's really about being scientific with it. And I think that's the big thing that's sort of come out when we're still in a space where we don't have research saying there is one, best fit for everyone. We're in a space where we know that diet definitely works. And I think there would be a lot of people on this call who would attest to that, who would probably have been using dietary modifications in their own life and found things that work for them. It's something that I would say test. If you're at a point where you're wondering, especially if there's a specific thing, such as alcohol, that you're wondering, is there something that getting rid of will help manage MS? Look into it, but do it scientifically. So I think the really difficult thing about this is when people make a lot of different changes at once, then working out if they see any difference, what was the cause of that difference. So if it's, something where it is just one thing like alcohol, what I would suggest from a research perspective is that what you do is you monitor your own symptoms for a period of time, 3 or 4 weeks before you make any changes. Take note of how fatigued you're feeling every day, symptoms that matter to you, and then make the change and continue to monitor those symptoms. Give it time to see. You're not going to see a change in a week. Give it a period of time where, if you completely cut out alcohol, continue to monitor and see, does it make a difference for you? Because for some people it might, other people it might not. And then you can, assess that. But you need to, there's no point doing it doing it for 2 days, not feeling any different, and then going back to it, or not really taking note of how you felt beforehand, then making the change and going, well, do I feel any different? I don't know. You need to think about it, I guess, as a scientist. But in terms of research that I've seen, and again, there may be some that I've missed. There was close to 5,000 research papers on MS published last year alone. So there are certainly some things that get through the net, but I haven't seen anything definitive that suggests, and it certainly wasn't one of the things mentioned at the conference in terms of, it's not like smoking where we say, yes, definitely cutting out smoking will help. I haven't seen anything in that space.
I know Liz has posted a couple of links to some studies in the Q&A for people as well. So one of the questions is, talked a lot about progressive MS, and some said they've just been diagnosed with primary progressive. Is there any news on this subject? And they said that they've just started with ECTRIMS.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the biggest news just in terms of progressive MS that I think is important to note is that there is a really big focus on it at the moment. And I think that's very different to even 5 years ago. I think quite rightly, not that long ago, people with progressive MS felt like they were being overlooked a little bit, that there was a lot of research going on into relapsing remitting MS, but progressive MS was, not the same. I think that's definitely changed. I mean, we now have the International Progressive MS Alliance that's focused purely on supporting research into progressive MS. We've seen ECTRIMS come out that has shown minor benefits for people with primary progressive MS, obviously much more significant benefits in relapsing remitting, but it's shown a little bit. Beyond that, there was some interesting genetic information that was presented at ECTRIMS around progressive MS, in particular primary progressive MS, where they seem to have identified genes that are directly linked to progression, which is pretty big news. Because we've had a lot of genes that, or variations of genes that influence susceptibility. So what we would call genetic risk factors, where, if you have this version of the gene, your risk of developing MS is higher. But none really where we'd seen them linked to progression. And this was one that seemed to sit very clearly as being linked to progression. And so, the interesting thing about that is that if we can understand what that gene codes for, then we can look at that as potentially being a target for things. Now, obviously, that process is long. So it's, I can't sit here and say, this is great, we're going to have something come out the next couple of years. It's a long time period, unfortunately. But yeah, I think the biggest message is that there is a focus on it, that people are looking into it, that we're seeing certainly treatments being tested in progressive MS that I don't necessarily think they would have been done before. So yeah, while I'd love to have more groundbreaking news than that, I think that's probably the positive thing to take out of it.
And I must do a little plug actually for OMS and the webinars, because we did actually have a focused one on progressive MS last year, and we've also got a thematic circle set up specifically for people living with progressive MS, so people can access that on our website.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay, somebody's asked again, and this is a fair point because I have to say I kept having to look it up, is regarding ECTRIMS podcast and website. What does ECTRIMS stand for? So if you can just remind us of that again, please, Brett.
I should know it, shouldn't I? It's the European Committee for Treatment and Research into Multiple Sclerosis.
Gold star.
There we go.
Yeah, absolutely.
It would be bad if I got that wrong.
Just talking about timings, and you're saying that things aren't going to necessarily happen overnight. What's the general time lag, say, between published research and then MSTranslate presenting that and sharing
it? Good question. It really depends on, obviously we don't summarize every paper that comes out, so there will be some where the time lag is huge. I would say in that instance, though, if there is research that people see that they're interested in, they can forward it to us and we will do summaries of it, because we want to make sure that the summaries that we do is obviously the information that people are interested in. Otherwise, it will depend, really. I mean, there are some that we try and get out very quickly if it's really groundbreaking news and things that we want to make sure we get out before it starts to appear in mainstream media so that people get the right version of it first.
Yeah.
Other things, you know, if it's more niche stuff, it could be weeks. It really does just depends. There's nothing, you know, we will continue to look back at research that's been published throughout the year to see whether it's worth summarizing. Again, it comes a little bit back to the notion of MSTranslate being unfunded. If it was our sole responsibility was to do MSTranslate, then that time lag would be much less. But I think probably the important thing to mention in this space as well is that anything that gets summarized on MSTranslate is summarized based on the research article. And that is something that is different to a number of other sites or things out there that are really just based on press releases and summarizing press releases. Part of the reason for a bit of an increased lag is that I will go back and look at the data, look through the actual article to make sure that the summaries that we're providing are as accurate as they can be. But yeah, it can differ.
Okay. Last couple of questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, go for it.
Somebody said that they were originally diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS, and now they've got secondary progressive MS. Is it really a different diagnosis or continuum which can regress as well as progress?
Good question. I mean, it's not really a different diagnosis. I would say that it is just a continuation of the same disease. You know, it used to be that we would say roughly 50% of people would go from relapsing remitting to secondary progressive within 10 years. Now that's significantly decreased. That was the stats when I was starting doing research. Now with effective therapies, a lot of people will never go to secondary progressive MS, or that time period is much longer to get to secondary progressive. In terms of can you go back the other way? Not really in terms of how we think about it, though what I would say as well in this space is that there is a large push, and there was a paper that came out last Friday that's really pushing to get rid of these terms, that relapsing remitting, secondary progressive, primary progressive even, they're not particularly helpful for some of the reasons that I talked about before. You know, when we shift to secondary progressive thinking, you know, treatments aren't effective. Well, a lot of them still are. So yeah. Especially when we talk about secondary progressive, there's differences in terms of criteria that people will use to say that someone's gone to secondary progressive. So you wouldn't really regress, but it's possible that, you know, someone thought you'd gone to secondary progressive and then turns out you hadn't, or something like that. But yeah, there is a push to sort of shift away from those terms anyway.
And then our final question, Brett, are there any updates about statins for MS?
None at the moment. There is a really large trial going on looking at them. My understanding is actually happening in London. My understanding is that we were expecting results in 2024, I believe, is when we're expecting results for that to come out. I haven't seen any. Sometimes you will see in these trials, people release interim analysis if they've started to get some results during the trial. I haven't seen anything on that yet. We may get some at ECTRIMS next year. Jeremy Chataway was leading that study, I believe, out of London. But yes, there is an interest in it. There is a large trial that's going on that I think was a 5 to 6 year trial. But yeah, we're expecting results in 2024. So we're just in a holding pattern while we wait for those to come out.
So one last cheeky question from me. Was there anything, what was your sort of biggest takeaway or insight at the most recent conference? Was there something that really challenged even like your thinking?
So good question. I think some of the biggest takeaways were the genetic stuff into the progressive MS, I think was really interesting, because it's the first time that we've been able to see genes linked to progression. So I think that was exciting. I think more some of the stuff that we're starting to think about in terms of how we're doing this research is also important. So being able to compare something like AHSCT or stem cell therapy with existing treatments, I think is really important, because we've now got a lot of clinical trial data suggesting that AHSCT can be a really effective therapy for really effective long-term therapy for people living with MS. I mean, we've got data out to 8 to 10 years where we see people have almost gone into complete remission of their disease. But with that, we still haven't really had a clear picture in terms of how it fits into the treatment landscape. Really, it's been still the same of it's a last resort. And I think as we start to now see research like the one that I touched upon, where we can start to compare it to other therapies, if you can start to show really clearly that, look, putting people on this therapy is better, much better than putting them on Gilenya, or much better than putting them on Tysabri, or whatever it is, then we may start to see that change. And I think the way we're starting to think about treatments is interesting. That it's, and I mentioned this actually in one of the podcasts, I think that what I think is important is that, we're not, it's not just been a case of we now have these treatments, good, job done, move on. There's a real thought on how can we optimize the use of these treatments? How can we, really make sure that we're using these treatments in the way that is got the best interests of people living with MS at the heart of it? How do we make sure that we're minimizing risks for them while also maximizing the benefits that they get from them? I think that was a big takeaway. And as I said, I think probably the other big thing for me was just that there is going to be a focus on a lot of different themes that we haven't seen before. And it's almost like an agreement that these will be included at every meeting. And again, that's a big shift. I mean, if I went back to Berlin, which was 2018, so 4 years ago, there wasn't a lot of focus on areas like lifestyle modifications, areas like symptom management. They were starting to come in a little bit, but there was the odd talk here and there, where now it's, we've got entire sessions devoted to these things. And I think that's largely due to people living with MS and the fact that they've talked about it and said, this is, we love the fact that you're doing research on new treatments. It's all important. We want to understand the disease as much as you do. But at the same time, we need research that's going to benefit us now. So what can we be doing to help manage our disease, diet, exercise, sleep, smoking, these things? Yeah. And how can we better manage our symptoms? And so I think the fact that there's a focus on that is just, and a continued focus and really an agreement that this is going to be a part of all of these conferences is really important. And the only other thing I would say is that actually for the first time, there was a day after the conference. So the conference went Wednesday to Friday. And then on the Saturday, there was a day specifically for people living with MS, where people living with MS were invited to turn up if they were in Amsterdam, or tune in via the live stream to hear from some of the key people of the conference, talk about the research from the conference in a way that was easy to understand. And so again, I think that's an understanding and a commitment that we need to all be doing better to make sure that we're having these two-way conversations with the MS community, which obviously is what MSTranslate is all about. So it's fantastic to see that the conferences are starting to take that message on as well.
Yeah, and the MS community being obviously at the core of it.
Yeah.
So
because they're the point of everything that we do. I mean, there is no point of doing MSTranslate, there's no point of doing research without the MS community.
Yeah. And so does that happen? Is it every October, the ECTRIMS conference, and then it's rotated in terms of where it's held? And do you know where
Yep.
next year's is?
We do. So I've already got the date and location for next year. So next year is October 11th to 13th in Milan, in Italy. Every few years there is a joint meeting that's held between ECTRIMS and ACTRIMS, which is the American version.
Right.
And so occasionally one of the meetings is held in America. I think it must be every 6 years, because it's every 3 years, but one of those is held in Europe. So, but yes, next year in Milan, October.
Lovely. Well, we'd love to have you back if you would be happy to, maybe towards the end of next year again, and do the same thing and share with
Definitely.
them. Be brilliant. I just wanted to thank you so much for, I know, and I really appreciate actually, because we've overrun, but we've kept people with us, which is always an indication that people want to hear more. So thank you so much for joining us today.
No, anytime.
And yeah, we'll obviously be in touch, but we'd definitely love to have you back next year and hear more about what's discussed at next year's conference and the latest research. So thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Brett.
Well, and it goes without saying that if you have people who watch at a later time and have questions, feel free to forward them to me. I'm happy to answer any subsequent questions that come through as well. But yeah, it's been my pleasure, and hopefully people have found it interesting. And thank you for all of the questions. They were fantastic.
No, thank you. I'll just close off now, but thank you once again, Brett. Very much appreciative. So that's the end of our session. We'll be back next month. Will be the last one in our Finding Hope webinar series for 2022. We'll be joined by Steve Simpson-Yap from the NEU, as well as Dr. Jonathan White, and they'll be talking about diet and MS. As always, you will receive the link a few days after today, which will take you back to the website for the recording, and of course Brett's PowerPoint for you to review afterwards. Yeah, thank you once again, Brett, and I'll see everybody soon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.